think we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Shimano School. My name is JP DeRose, and I am joined by MLF Touring Pro David Walker. David, how you doing, bud?
I'm doing good. How about you, JP?
Doing good. So we've got David remotely on location. He's at the camper right now, so we're going to try to keep in contact with him through the signal where he's at. But tonight is going to be kind of a fun night. We got a bunch of people jumping on already. Guys, every other week we do this Shimano School, and I'm going to ask you guys, Matthew already knows it, I'm going to ask you, where are you checking in from? Put down in the comment section, let me know where you're checking in from. Something like this, Matthew just said he's checking in from Corpus Christi, Texas. Matthew, hope you're doing well. So let us know in the comment section. We've had people from all over the world checking in to watch these things out. And one thing you want to remember, the Shimano Schools are all about teaching you guys a little bit more about this awesome sport we call fishing. Today is going to be focused on bass, and we're going to focus on power fishing with David Walker. So a bunch of different things we can talk about. If you guys have questions,
Sure.
put them in the comment section. David's here to answer them for you. So, David, it's good to see you. I missed you at ICAST this year. Did you go?
I did not go. Matter of fact, I was packing up my house to move. So I didn't have time to go to ICAST this year. I had a couple of weeks to pack up everything I'd owned for 21 years, and that was a busy week. I know ICAST is busy, but that was a busy week. I can just tell you.
So did you find you had stuff that you completely forgot you even owned when you do that? 21 years is a long time to be in a place.
Oh, no question. You find things you've been looking for when you got to move them all, JP. I tell you. Yeah, I found so much stuff, and it was overwhelming, to be honest with you. It's not something you want to do very often, but it's all good. It worked out, and like I said, I did find some things that I was glad I found, to be honest with you.
Yeah, now here's the real. Now you're going to see how much truth you tell. How many bags of tackle did you find that you forgot you bought?
I say it is bad. It is bad, to be honest with you. A bit of a pack rat, that's yeah. So yeah, I found some stuff that I was like, man, I don't even know why I'm hanging on to this stuff, but it was just, to be honest with you, a lot of things that you collected over the years were things that were just like you bought going to tournaments and stuff, and you kind of just squirreled them away. They were thrown in a Ziploc bag or something, and you just start digging them out, and you're like, oh, this stuff, it's just no good. It's just too old. Soft plastics and stuff, they just don't last that long. Well, you wish they would, but
they do not. And I think the manufacturers prefer that they do not last too long. But yeah, just checking in with some of the people here. Ketchin Mo, good to see you. Long Beach, New York. Folks, this is on both our YouTube channel and our Facebook channel for Shimano Fish North America, Shimano North America Fishing, depending what channel you're on. We've got Louisiana in the house. David, how are you? Punta Gorda, Florida, Malaysia, on our YouTube channel, Fort Pierce, Florida. Paul Powis from Kitchener, Ontario. Paulie, how you doing? Better known as my dad. I call him Dad all the time. And Larry and Tammy Crow from Punta Gorda, Florida. So Cape Cod, Massachusetts. So, folks, I hope everybody's doing well. We're going to get this one rolling. We got some people tuned in already. David, we're going to talk power fishing. I know you're a big fan of the big stick. You love throwing a jig probably as much as anybody I know. So why don't we start right there? So for people who are into bass fishing, what is it about throwing jigs, and how do you set yourself up to do it?
Okay, so just a little background on it. So when I first started bass fishing, fishing in tournaments, even, just club level stuff, one of the first things I learned was that a jig was, I had an ability to catch larger fish with it. And it's all about you. The jig doesn't have any action to it. You impart the action. You put the jig where it needs to be. And so for me, I really liked that part, was because where I grew up at in Michigan, we had a lot of grass. So we fished a lot of grass offshore. So reeling things around and stuff, it didn't go through the grass. So you Texas rigged or you pitched around jigs and stuff. And so that's really where I got my first confidence lure, was a jig. And so next step, you go to the bigger national tournaments and stuff like that. So when the going gets tough, you're going to rely on that lure that you got a lot of confidence in. And that for me was the jig, because that's what I started with. And so it has evolved into my favorite bait. And because of, one, the confidence, but two, the versatility. Now, there's very few lures that you can fish everywhere we go, but you can pretty much fish a jig everywhere we go. And so it's one of those lures I always have tied on. I just always have it tied on. And, that to me is what makes it such a good lure. That being said, there's a variety of ways of fishing a jig. We got different jig types out there. Personally, I've got 4 different styles of, jigs that are my signature series jigs. We've got a flipping jig, we've got a power finesse jig, we've got a football jig, and we've got a swim jig. Now, the flipping jig is the one that really I use most of the time. And for that, the G Loomis flipping stick, like the first flipping stick I ever really fell in love with was a G Loomis GLX flipping stick, but it was telescopic. Now they made
I
it to where
remember.
you could telescope, so it would fit into the little boats, but now everybody's got these giant boats, so we don't really need telescopic rods. But yeah, that was my first flipping stick that I thought, man, this is the coolest fishing rod I've ever owned. And it was very technique specific, because 20 plus years ago, there was not a big trend towards lures matched to the rod. Like, you didn't have cranking rods, you didn't have, you had a fishing rod and you used whatever it was, and you tie a different lure on the same rod. That's how we mostly worked it. But a flipping stick was that rod that really stood out, is that's what you used it for, was flipping.
Now, you hear a lot of the talk, and we'll stick with the flipping jig. We'll talk about each of the styles of jigs. You hear a lot of talk about, using a braid versus using a fluorocarbon. And I mean, back in the day, we all threw mono. I still remember throwing 20-pounder, 25-pound big game back in the day, right? So that's all that we really had a choice of.
yeah, it was huge. Yeah.
But so
Yeah.
for you with a flipping jig, are you relying on one or the other, braid or fluoro? Do you have rods for both, and do you change the rod you use?
I do. So I prefer to use just straight fluoro. That's my preferred way of using it. And, because you get the sensitivity, but it's not hypersensitivity. It's very manageable. It's very quiet. It's very subdued. It doesn't stand out. It doesn't like braid will. And then as far as braid, when I'm using straight braid, normally it's under one of those conditions where it's very situational. Like, say I'm at Lake Okeechobee and I'm flipping a jig around those, it's straight braid, because it is just all grass. That's what you're dealing with. And I think that was one of the first things I learned when braid first came to be popular in the flipping culture. I tried it right away and it was too much. It was so sensitive. Everything felt like a fish. I felt like I was getting hung up a lot more than I did without the braid. And so I really wasn't seeing the benefits of it. But when you get into grass situation, the benefits far outweigh those things. So if I'm flipping a lot of wood, I'm going to stick with the fluorocarbon. If I get into where it's, even open water, I'll stick with the fluorocarbon. But when it gets to that, it's just heavy vegetation, that's when I'll switch over to the braid.
Interesting. Now, do you change the action of the rod when
I,
you're doing that?
I do, but only slightly. So I will go down on, and in the powers, I'll go down to like 1. So like my favorite flipping stick is the 894. 894 FPR. Love that rod. I love the action of it. I've tried the 5s, and even back in the day when he had 6s, I used some of those. And it was, I was using those back when we were using that great big monofilament you were talking about, because the
Yep.
mono was such a rubber band. I was trying to get rid of that stretch in there. And that's what the rod will do for you. So, but the 894 today's 894 is hands down my favorite one. So if I go to a braid, I'm going to go down to the 893. I'm going to go to a little softer power, because trying to check up on your hook set is extremely hard to do, because
Yes.
that's the highlight of the day, right? You know what?
Oh yeah.
Really look, I don't want to just pull into one. I want to jack them, So sure enough, I will go down on that power size to compensate for the zero stretch.
Now, I know with Loomis, so many different models of rods, especially in the ones you're talking. You're probably using an 894, like you said, FPR, which is a flip punch rod.
Right.
Have you ever tried switching to a jig and worm rod, so a JWR, where the taper is completely different than the FPR?
I do, and that's a good point, because when it comes to like the power finesse jigs or the swim jigs, then that's when I'll go down. I'll get away from that FPR and go to the jig and worm rods for sure. That's an important point, because you're dealing with a lighter bait normally, a little bit sized, and so that the rod being having a little bit different taper will load differently, and it makes casting that bait a little easier to do.
Absolutely. All right. So that's your breakdown on your flipping jigs. And so if you had to compare flipping jigs to Texas rigs, I hear this debate all the time. When do you throw a flipping jig, and when do you switch to a Texas rig plastic in the same areas? Is there a time and place, or is it a fishery or a time of year thing for you? How do you make your decision?
Yeah, all those factors are involved in it. For me, my standard is the jig. Okay, I'll show up with it tied on. Now, if the conditions are different, being as say it's wintertime, usually extremely cold weather, a jig is going to be a better. It's going to be a better lure for you as far as getting bites, and it's going to catch those really big fish. During the spawn, a jig can be it'll still get the bites, but it always seems to have a lot of short strikes. It always seems to have a tendency to miss a lot of fish, because they're biting at the bait instead of trying to eat the bait. Those pre-spawners, I love them. The jig, they are all over it. But once they get on that bed, that's when that plastic really seems to do a little bit better. So for me, there's situations when that is, or if you're dealing with maybe a fishery that just doesn't have very many large fish, or if the water is, maybe it's ultra clear. A lot of times in ultra clear water, that profile of the bigger, bulkier jig just isn't as appealing as it, there's times when that's not true, but one thing about fishing, there's never any absolutes. Everything's pretty much a generality, and you got to know that going in, that there is no if this then that's. So
yes, there's no formula. There's no finite formula, because if there was, I always tell people there would be no fish left, because we would have caught them all. Right?
We'd have already caught them all.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we got our first question here, and this fits perfectly into what we're talking about. So David Constant is saying he's a high school fishing coach. He'd like to know how you would teach a young fisherman to flip a jig around lots of structure without getting hung up so much. And I know you mentioned fluorocarbon, so he says he doesn't flip enough to teach it. So, David, what is your advice for a guy teaching young kids how to fish a jig?
Okay. So I think one thing that's probably missing in our whole, like when we talk about flipping anymore, nobody really flips. We either, like I do it myself, like I either underhand skip or sidearm it and skip it back underneath there, or I'm pitching the bait. The old school technique of actually flipping, where you have the line in one hand and then the rod in the other, and you basically pendulum that bait back and forth and drop it into a spot, really placing it in there. You don't use the reel at all. You don't cast. You have X amount of line out, and that's it. And that is a technique that when I first started flipping, that's the way we did it. So you get really close to the target. Nowadays, it seems like we're having to back away from that, albeit sometimes it's water clarity, sometimes it's fishing pressure, sometimes it's both. But being able to get up there closely and basically just using that pendulum motion to rock that lure back and forth, and then just place it right where you want it, drop it in there, jig it up and down a couple times, lift it up, and repeat that process. When you take that, trying to make that tricky cast out of the equation, you're going to find that you're not going to get hung up near as much. You're not going to get those backlashes, and it's going to give you an opportunity to really see just how well you can place that lure into those tight little spots. Crappie fishermen have been doing it for years, and they still do it, where you basically almost like a cane pole, you just drop it straight into the little spot. With the bass jig, you can do the same thing. You use, like I said, 894 flip pitching rod, and you're just going to use that pendulum motion and just place that jig, and you'll get really good at that, at practicing that, to where what you want to do is, because you're so close to that fish, you don't want to hit the water hard. You want that lure to surprise the fish in the manner that he sees it and he thinks the lure didn't see him first. So if that makes sense to you, but so that I think is a great technique that people can learn, and you can practice that technique not even in a boat, just standing in the yard or standing in the garage, just swinging that thing back and forth and placing that lure into those little places, those little spots that you just can't really cast to. It's ideal for lay downs and really tangled brush, treetops, things like that, where getting that bait through there horizontally is just nearly impossible to do. Dropping that bait right through the top of whatever that target is, I mean, that, to me, that's exactly what I would do. First, trying to teach somebody the idea of just showing them just how weedless, or we call it weedless, but it's not weeds. You just don't want to get it stuck, but just how snag resistant a jig can be.
Yeah. And David, like, hopefully that helps you a lot. The other thing I would say, I've taught some people how to do this, is tell them to be patient. If they got the right rod with a soft checking tip, like David talks about with an 894, you don't have to set the hook on everything. You can actually check the fish to see if it's a fish, rather than, being on a limb and then setting the hook into a limb, which is going to bury the hook straight into it. So
yeah, sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not.
Sometimes it is not. You're right. So hopefully that helps you, David. So again, we're still talking to David Walker here, folks. For those of you tuning in, this is another edition of Shimano School. My name is JP DeRose. We're here with MLF Pro David Walker talking power fishing. So we're going to move on to the next one that David and I were talking about earlier, chatterbaits. I mean, this bait came out hot, went away for a while, and came back with a vengeance, and it has not slowed down since.
It's here to stay.
It is here to stay.
Yeah, for sure.
So how do you set yourself up to power fish with a bait like the chatterbait? And maybe explain to those who don't know what a chatterbait is.
Right. So a chatterbait is basically a swim jig with a vibrating lip on the front of it. Now, the reason it vibrates is because it's not directly attached to the bait. It's in the hook eye of the lure, and as it's coming through the water, that goes back and forth, and it causes the whole thing to chatter, basically the chatterbait. So it is, to me, it's a swim jig. Like the first chatterbait I ever saw, I'm looking at it and I'm like, it's a swim jig with a lip on it, and as soon as you put it in the water, you're like, oh man, that thing's crazy. It moves, it makes so much, so much movement to it, and it's so easy to fish too. I mean, you basically throw it out, reel it back in. It does the work for you. Surprisingly weedless, because it is an open hook design. Now I've got one that we make through Z-Man. That's the cross-eyes chatterbait, and we have got a brush guard on it. It's a wire guard. So around those situations where you've got wood, you've got docks that got ropes hanging on them. Oh my gosh, ropes are the worst. I mean, you cast around at marina and you find a rope, you are there. But with this one here, it has the dual, I call them weed guards, but they're really not. They're just to keep the hook from getting stuck on everything they get near. But so my first, experiences with the chatterbait was as a swim jig. So I kind of used swim jig rods, and I was using braid mostly with it. And I kept losing fish with it that I just felt like I shouldn't have lost. And so as it, time went on, I kept using it more and more. And I've found that straight fluoro to me is the best setup for my chatterbaits. I'll use straight floral line. I use 18 or 20 pound test. I don't use light lines. There's really no need in it. It's a very castable bait. You know, whatever size you're using, quarter, 3/8, half, 5/8, don't matter. They cast easy, so you don't really need a lighter line. And that heavier line just does a great job of really allowing you to rip that bait through the grass. Say if it gets stuck in some grass, you can rip it out of there, and just kind of handling fish around a lot of cover, because, you know, a chatterbait is, gosh, it's replaced my spinnerbait fishing. It really has. And, you know, I never thought that would happen, but it has. And so the rods that I use, though, are much heavier action than what is the preferred rods for. You know, the guys that I know that are, you know, diehard chatterbait guys, they view the bait more of a swim bait. So the style of rods is much more of that swim bait rod style. But for me, when I first got into that bait, I was working on it as a swim jig. So I kept going the other way on the power spectrum. So like my favorite rod is a 855, like, or
Wow.
you know, the 55, the yeah, the 855. So the 855, which is a very stiff rod, there's not a lot
Yeah.
of action to it, but boy, I tell you, it sticks them, and they stuck, and that's the part that I just can't get over. So I don't. It's one of those things that for me, it ain't broke, but don't fix it. But I have got my hands on the new chatterbait rod and now the one I've got is IMX Pro.
Yep.
And now I've been using it on the chatterbait that's more the stealth model chatterbait, the one that's got a little bit smaller hook to it, got a little smaller profile to it, a little lighter hook. And because I felt like with my other rod, I was kind of overpowering the hook. And I think that's one thing that will cue you in on a bait. If you look at the hooks on that bait, that a lot of times will tell you just how heavy of an action you need just to match the hook, let alone the bait size, and then take that out of the equation. But when you look at, and you got something that's got a fine wire hook to it, many times you need to go down in that power, because you're overtaxing those hooks because the rod is just too stiff. And so with those, more of those new finesse, and I think you're going to see more of that, because the chatterbait, it's not going anywhere. So I think we're going to see more and more versions of that chatterbaits coming. And so I think, you know, we're not going to have one chatterbait rod anymore. I think those days are going away.
I already have 3, David. I have 3
Right,
different chatterbait rods. So
that's exactly right. And I think it's going to be situational again. I think we're going to start seeing where you got to use this chatterbait rod for these chatterbaits under this situation. So, but you know, that's what's great about Loomis is you can really fine tune your game. And what I mean by that is when it comes to those powers and those rods, and then like you said, you can switch. It's still a 7.5-foot rod. You know, you look at an 894 FPR, 894 JWR.
yeah.
It's, you know, technically it's the same rod, but it's not when you pick them up and start dealing with the actions of them. And then you start fine tuning those powers, you know, with, you know, and if people don't know that about G Loomis, all those numbers we're discussing. So when you talk about at 894, that means it's 89 inches long and it is a 4-power rod. Of 4, 5 being a much stiffer rod, 6 being the ultimate down the range. Yeah. So when you soften the rod up, you go down in the numbers, and when you stiffen the rod up, you go higher in the numbers. And then that first 2 numbers denotes how long the rod is. So it may sound a little confusing because everybody's used to medium heavy, that type of talk. But with the Loomis, you can really define that because they really do split the hairs for you and make it to where you can customize that rod to you. And when you're comfortable with that rod and it's working for you, that's when that's how it should be. Because when the rods you don't like them, you don't really like the feel of them, they don't fit you. But when you can customize it to what suits your needs, that's when you got a good fishing rod.
Yeah, and for Loomis, for those of you who don't know, the powers that David's talking about, they really start at 0 and go to 6. So 0 would be an ultralight, 1 would be a medium light, 2 would be a medium, 3 would be a medium heavy, 4 would be a heavy, 5, like David said, 855 is his
It's
favorite
cool.
rod for a chatterbait. It's a pool cue. It's
It,
an extra heavy rod. It's 85 inches long, which is the same as 7'1". So that's how you break down those numbers.
yeah.
All right, so we got some questions that relate kind of to what you've been talking about. And I'm going to go back a bit. Folks, just keep asking questions. I'm going to get to them. So Sharon's online from Punta Gorda, sorry. And she's asking, now this applies to the chatterbait because she asked right away, what's the best all-around reel for your average fisherman? And I asked her what kind of fishing, and she's saying redfish. So for me, redfish and largemouth are very, very similar. So what would you recommend for a reel to do all-around fishing? Gear ratio, size, model?
Sure. And I've done a lot of red fishing over the years, and used to fish some of the redfish circuits as well.
Yeah, you did.
And the reason I did that was just like you said, they're very similar. Like you can grab your bass fishing tackle and go red fishing because you can use basically the same stuff. Spinning reels, I'm using 2500s or 3000 series. You're not going to use giant reels for those. Bait casters the same way, like as far as like if you're going to go buy one reel that maybe you've not owned a Shimano reel and you just don't want to break the bank, that Shimano, the Corrados, you can take those things and catch anything with them. You really can. Like the Corrado K's is, it's been out a few years, but honestly, those reels to me are just, that's my standard right there. Like, can it throw as far as one of those? Is it as tough as one of those? It's just a great reel. And, for somebody going to do some inshore fishing, no doubt, those size of reels, the same ones you'd use for bass fishing are the ones you're going to use for inshore, any type of inshore fishing.
So when we talk gear ratios, all of the Shimano Curado lineups are available in 3 gear ratios, usually a 6.3 or 6.4 to 1, a 7.2, 7.3 to 1, and an 8.1 or 8.5 to 1, depending on the model. Jack of all trades, would you stick in the middle and get that HG, that 7 to 1?
I would. If you're just going to buy one, I would. Personally, ever since the 8.5 has come out, I have got 90% of my reels are now 8.5 gear ratio, because once you use it and you get accustomed to that speed, the only reels that I don't have that higher gear ratio is my cranking reels. And when I pick up one of those, and if I mix it up and like have the wrong reel on there, because other than the little numbers on there, they look exactly the same. You'll be like, gosh, I'm reeling like crazy, and that bait's just not moving. Once you get used to that 8.5 to 1 gear ratio, man, you'll love it. You really will. It's what, 36 inches every turn
35 to 36, depending on the size of the spool. Yeah.
So like you turn the handle one rotation, you've moved your lure 3 feet. That's how quick those are. But just for all around use, yeah, I think staying in the, which used to be the high end, the 7 point something to 1, that used to be the top of the line. That's now mid range, and I think for the most people out there, that 7.3, 7.1, whatever it might be, whatever that range I think that'll work for a lot of your needs. It really will.
Come on, David. I know you're lying. You remember when the 6 to 1s were fast? Because I do.
Gosh, I do. Yes, I'm telling you, them old reels. I've got, like I said, when I'm being a pack rat, I've found so many of them old reels that I had, some old round Shimanos that were just like, I don't know what the gear ratio is. It's I don't know how to use them. I really don't.
Yeah, I think I remember like back when like Calcutta 200 first came out. I still have my original Calcutta 200. It's 27 years old now, and it was a 5 to 1, which was that was my frogging reel back in the day. Where now I wouldn't even, like, I would pull my hair out. I don't have much hair left, but I would pull my beard hairs out trying to use a 5 to 1 to go frogging. So the game has changed.
It is crazy, the difference in the speed on the reels, and they're so much better, honestly. Like the new reels compared to the older reels, like when you pick them up and just feel just the fit on them, you know, like every piece on the older reels wobbled from the reel seat to the end of the handle. You had a lot of action going on up in there. Now that's gone. And, you know, so the new stuff is really impressive. It always surprises me how much better you can get. Cause you think, I mean, how much better is this reel really? But, you know, in small increments, you may not notice it as much, but like when you go back, grab a reel that's 10 years ago to now and compare, then you'll see what all the new differences really are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So here's one from our YouTube viewer, Lincoln G. He's got a couple on here. He's asking a couple questions. So we're talking chatterbaits still. Maybe talk weights of chatterbaits and trailers, because it's funny. He asked why I have 3 rods, and this is the reason why, is because of the weights of the chatterbaits and the cover that I fish them in. So, David, what's the most popular weights for you to have, and why?
I'm going to say I throw the 1/2 ounce chatterbait most of the time. Now I will throw the 3/8 some. And when I go down to a 3/8 size, it's because, for the most part, the water is just that shallow. Like, so you're fishing a chatterbait horizontally. And if the water column that you have is very thin, then a heavier chatterbait is you're constantly trying to keep it up off that bottom. So the lighter ones I use in the thinner conditions, thinner being depth of water that I'm dealing with, and then the heavier chatterbaits. So, I mean, you know, most of the time, if I'm fishing 4 to 6 foot of water, 7, 8 foot of water at the most, I'm going to go with that 1/2 ounce, because that's, and, you know, 3/4, 90% of the time, that's the water column that I'm going to be fishing in. So it works good for me. Now, some of these real flat, shallow bays or places where the reel's real thin, you know, that's when I'm going to go back down to that 3/8. But one thing that's always important about baits is heavier baits are more user friendly than light baits, because your accuracy will be better with them. They're easier to throw. You get more distance out of them, and you have a better feel with them. So as the bait weight goes up, you can feel what that bait's doing better than you can on a lighter one. So especially when you first start out, you know, chatterbaits, they vibrate like crazy. So you're going to feel what's going on there. But for the most part, all those baits are, when they get a little heavier, they start creating resistance to you, and you feel that, and it's noticeable.
And for trailers, I mean, it's hard to argue that they make a
Yeah.
great trailer that usually comes with the chatterbait. And I know some people like throwing swim
Yeah.
baits, some razor shads.
Yeah.
You know, is there a reason why you pick one over the other?
So when I first started using the chatterbaits, I was using that little split tail that came in the package, you know,
Yep.
just that little, and, you know, and which was fine, but it makes a very small profile of your lure. And so as we started adding things to them, you know, going swim baits, boot tails, what have you, you know, we found out just how versatile of a lure it was, because you could change the overall look, size of it, and action just by changing those. So I think that's what's important to know, is like when there's not you have to use this trailer to go with it, because there's so many different conditions out there. Like if I want to fish the bait, say I want to fish it slow, then I'm going to use a little bigger trailer, because that allows me to slow the bait down. If I want to speed the bait up, I'll go with a more streamlined or a smaller. If the water's clear and I don't want it to be so big and in your face, I'll go with those more tapered down, like, you know, like you said, the razor shad and stuff like that. Now, if the water's dirty and you want a bulky bait, I'm reeling it kind of slow, then you can put a trailer on there that's like, got all the kicker legs, and, you know, just bulk it up to give it
Yep.
more action and more feel to that fish. So, yeah, trailers are endless. I mean, you honestly, and I don't think there's any wrong trailers out there, because over the years, I have tried so many different versions on there. I use a razor shad most of the time, just because it does such a good job of fitting
Yeah.
the bait, and the little tail action that goes along behind it. It does it. the chatterbait itself imparts the action into that tail, and you'll see it. It's clearly visible. So, but I've used them all, and I've caught fish on all different kinds of them. But yeah, but I think that's what's cool about baits that are versatile, is that it allows you to pick how you want it to look and how you want it to feel. And I like that. I like that part about fishing lures, that allow you to kind of make those adjustments.
Yeah, and then to go along with that, with the Y3 rods, for me it's weight driven. Rods, Lincoln, are designed to throw weights. If you ever look on a rod, they have a weight rating there. That weight rating is designed for the rod to properly load and release your bait with accuracy. And it also has to do with, as David said, the size of the hook. If I'm throwing something really with a really big hook, I'm probably not going to throw a 2 or a 3 power rod. I'm going to throw a 4 or a 5 power rod. If I've got something with that more finesse hook, yes, then you can get away with a 2 power, an 892 or an 852 or an 853 would probably work just fine. So that's why I like to have different rods, and that's the same reason why David likes, using different size chatterbaits for certain situations. It's all a system that's been brought along to make the angler cast better, cast further, hook set, land more fish, feel things better. It's why technique specific rods really evolved.
Yeah, it is, because I mean, if you've seen those fishing rods out there with the lure on the end of them, and the whole rod's just bouncing up and down. It's the rod's already overloaded, and you haven't even tried to make a cast with it. And those rods are impossible to be accurate with. You have a hard time setting the hook when your bait is overpowering your setup to begin with before you even try to throw it.
Yeah, you're in trouble.
So that's why technique specific has really caught on, because I mean, they're tools. It'd be like you open up a toolbox, and there's 400 wrenches in there. Why would you need so many? They all look just alike. Well, each one of them fits a very specific spot, and fishing rods are very similar to that.
Yeah, I use the analogy of golf clubs. Every golf club hits a ball a different distance and a different loft. It's the same difference with fishing rods. So this is nice to see. Jason, I'm glad this is working. Jason said, not a question, but a thanks. No other brands are educating their customer base weekly like y'all. And I speak for more than myself. We appreciate this. So much fun and educational. Big thanks. Well, Jason, awesome. This is exactly why we do this every 2 weeks, and I'm glad you are enjoying it. So love hearing that. Yeah. Love hearing that. So, folks, again, this is sorry, David. This is another Shimano School. We're here with MLF Pro David Walker, who actually has some off time now. When's your next event, David?
I have a charity tournament coming up this weekend on Old Hickory Lake in Tennessee for the Nashville Predators. That's the hockey team there in Nashville. They have a foundation where they raise money for it every year. So I'm going to be taking some folks fishing this coming weekend.
Nice.
As far as the tournament trails has wound down for me. And so it's time to get started on 2022 season.
Already.
All the new stuff we got to get ordered and put together.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So again, we are talking power fishing with David Walker. We have covered jigs and Texas rig and chatterbaits. And let's go to something that's pretty popular at certain times of the year is the swim jig.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So a swim jig's not an all year round thing. There are times where if you're not throwing a swim jig, you're going to get your rear end beat. So what's your setup when you're throwing a swim jig?
So with a swim jig, I'm not going to use my flipping stick anymore. Now I'm still going to use a long rod. So I'm going to go, I got 894, but I'm going to use the jig and worm rod. And the reason I like that is because that length allows me to really, because when you're fishing a swim jig, you're not fishing it close to you. You're making a long cast with it, and you're either straight retrieve or you're working that bait with the rod tip. And so as you're shaking that rod tip, that's imparting action into that swim jig. And so to have that longer rod like that is it's really important in casting, working the bait, and hook set, and getting that fish out of that cover, because the best situation for a swim jig is around a lot of vegetation, and especially vegetation that may be sort of emergent vegetation, the stuff that's sticking up out of the water just a little bit, or early in the year, maybe you're in a lily pad field that is full of those pad stalks. man, that can be some of the best swim jig fishing ever. And swim jig fishing is it's so much fun because it's very visual. You get most of the time you'll see the fish get the bait, even if the water's dirty or it's just super shallow. You'll still see the wake of that fish coming over to it, much like when you're frog fishing. That visual to get to see the fish get the bait. I mean, there's just nothing like it. You know, top waters. Everybody loves to see a fish grab a bait, and swim jigs to me are one of those bait that you really get to see the fish do it, and it covers water great. I mean, it's so effective at casting and retrieving, so you can keep moving. So when you're trying to fish a big area, covering some water, that swim jig allow you to do that because of because you are casting, retrieving, working it back in. I almost always use straight braid on that because I am fishing around vegetation. But even if I'm not, for the most part, I'll use braid on them. Now, if I'm just throwing a swim jig, say I'm skipping a swim jig around docks, maybe it's a shad spawn kind of thing. And so at those situations, I'll I'll go ahead and use the fluoro most of the time with that. But if I'm fishing that grass, once again, I'm going to go with with the braided line. So, but my rod for that's going to be 894 or 893 GLX jig and worm rod. Now the new NRX pluses, I I hate to say it, but I like them better than the GLXs, and I've always been a GLX guy, like 20 plus years of it. And but the new NRX Plus, I'm so impressed with the backbone of those rods. To me, NRX was always by far the most sensitive rods out there. They were super light, super amount of feel to them. Like you could feel everything. Like nothing goes undetected. But I was always a little leery of the powers. Didn't seem like a 4-power NRX didn't really line up as a 4-power GLX to me. And now I get the feeling that NRX Plus, it's got so much backbone to it. I just love that rod. So if you can get your hands on one, I'm telling you, that thing is money because they are so much lighter. And when the lighter the rod gets, the more you feel of what's going on out there, the more sensitivity you get. And it's just, I just love those rods. But I do stick with at least a 7'5" on my swim jig setup because I'm making casts with it. I'm skipping that jig. I want to generate speed. I want to generate distance and be able to set the hook and get that fish away from whatever it is he was around.
So I assume because you're doing that, the XG, the 8.5 to 1 or 8.4 to 1 is probably the reel you're going with as well.
Yep, I'm the faster the better on those. Faster the better, for sure, for sure.
All right, so that's your swim jig setup. We got a couple more comments and questions here. This one's an interesting one, and Jason, who mentioned something before, he said he loves using the chatterbait, but he loses a lot of fish on head shakes. I was using an X Pride 7.2 glass, and he tips. So this is it, Jason. Is it a medium heavy glass? Is it a heavy glass? Is it a medium glass? All these are going to make a difference. So if you can let us know in the comment section what power the glass rod is. For myself, I'm an 893 JWR guy on a chatterbait. David's an 855 JWR guy on a chatterbait. You know, and the IMX Pro medium heavy chatterbait bladed jig rod is one I use for open water. So he's saying medium heavy on the X Pride. Would you assume he's just not getting hook penetration here, David?
I think so. That was, like I said, when I first started throwing a chatterbait, I was trending towards that. You know, it looked like a swim jig to me. And at first, I was having the same problem. Like it seemed like I'd get the fish hooked, and the fish would come off, and it was very frustrating because I didn't feel like what I was doing wrong. I mean, it's an open hook. What could it's like you can't. It's not like you adjust the weed guard or trim them back or anything. And but I was using braid with it, and I felt like that was one of the problems. So I went away from that and I started using just straight fluoro. But I went up in the rod power selections, and I haven't looked back. I mean, I know it's not. It's just don't tell anybody I told you about it. But that's the one I'm using.
I was actually throwing an 895 JWR with a chatterbait. I was using the CFL chatterbait this past weekend, and I was throwing an 895. But again, I'm throwing it with fluoro, so there's a little bit of stretch involved
Yeah,
there.
right.
But
Yeah,
when I'm using a 4/0 flipping hook is in that thing, and you get a big old stubborn largemouth on the rocks that wants to eat that, I want to move him.
Yep, you do, because he's not close to you. Generally when the fish is close to you, you can really jack them. When they're out there a long ways, there's a lot between you and them. Resistance wise, that's eliminating what you did to set the hook. The drag of the through the water, the how the bait's in the fish's mouth, the stretch of the line. And that might be something too. I don't know if he's using straight fluoro or if he is, what size it is. But the bigger size, I think, seems to help too. Use 18 and 20. I wouldn't use 10, 12, 14 on it. I would.
Yeah, I'm an 18 FC sniper for me all day long, every day.
Yeah,
And it's tough to go wrong with it.
Yeah, very good. I think so.
Okay, so let's see. So he's saying swim bait fishing. Okay, so David Constance asking, what about swim bait fishing? Best brand, cadence, speed, or for jig or chatter? So swim baits, David.
Swim baits. So most of them I like to put on the back of my chatterbait, and that's how I throw. But yeah, so a swim bait is a different animal. So you do need to soften up that rod to allow the fish to get the bait. But that being said, most of the swim baits hooks are a heavier style hook. So you can't go down to like a cranking style rod that I would, a glass rod. So you've got to kind of mix it up a little bit. And I think that's where swim baits get very convoluted on as far as what's an ideal swim bait rod. I think that too. And how big is the swim bait? Like my favorite swim baits are the little small ones. The little 2-3 inch swim baits. Those things catch so many fish. I don't fish the really big ones, like West Coast has been famous for years about, you can't make them big enough. These giant, look like they're casting a shoe, the
big old glide baits.
Yeah,
Yep.
Right. And the rod that you would need to throw that bait, but yet hook the fish properly is I not dealt with it. So I wouldn't even venture to go out on a limb and discuss it. But with the smaller ones that I'm rigging up on 1/4 ounce, 3/8 ounce jig heads, just 2, 3, 4/0 hooks, things like that in those. The JWRs or even, 873, like a Carolina rig rod. But I would go with a softer power. I wouldn't go with the stiffer ones. I'd go with the 2s and 3 powers on those for sure, because you don't need a lot of stiffness in those rods, because you do want to let the fish sort of get the bait. And by getting the bait, I mean, you don't quickly take it away from the fish. As soon as you feel him, as soon as you lose contact with that bait, many times that's when you jerk. But he still hasn't really, he's approaching the bait, but he hasn't really got the bait yet.
Well, this one's going to roll right into Jeremy Reese's question here. So covering water for smallies with a swim bait, say like a 3.8 inch Kitech with a 1/2 ounce head. What's your rod of choice? Is an 894 JWR too much? I think you just answered that, but I'm going to agree 100% with you here, David. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I'd go down at least to an 893 for sure. And you wouldn't think, just looking at the numbers or picking the rod up and shaking it, you would notice that much difference, but you really will. And it's one of those things that you gotta, once you've experienced those, you see the difference in those rods, then you'll find more uses for that and as well. Like your 894, that's a great rod for like Texas rigs to me. The Power Finesse jig that I like to use, it's a great rod for that too. But it is a little too stiff for just that swim bait, in my opinion. And I'm going to use a lighter line with that little swim bait too. And you get down and lowering that line size, lowering the weight of your bait. You want to back off on the power of that rod too.
Yeah, and Jeremy, I am a open hook swim bait's my wheelhouse where I live. Like, this is what we do in the north. And an 892 JWR casting JWR is the, in my opinion, best all-around open hook swim bait rod because it weighs nothing. It's 7'5". You can cast them a country mile, and up to that half ounce, you can lay the tar to a fish. Remember, you're throwing an open hook. I don't look for flipping hooks in my swim baits when I'm throwing open hook. I'm looking for like a 2X at most. So like a Mustad Ultra Point or a VMC, like a 2X 90-degree jig hook on a head. And with a 3/8, I use a rhythm wave a lot, and it is, I'm telling you, 892 will change your life. 18-pound fluoro for me, 16, 18 at most, and just wing it around and fish it like a spinner bait, and they eat it.
Yeah. It's important, and you'll notice the difference, and your accuracy will get better with your cast too. It really will.
Yeah. All right. So good old Bobo. Bobo, what's going on? He's asking, what Shimano bait casters do you throw? And so we talked about the Corrado K's. What other one have you put your hands on the new Bantams when they came? They're not so new anymore. It came out a couple years ago, but have you fished the Bantams at all, David?
I have not. I have. Ooh. And that's one thing about Shimano. There's so many choices out there. It's impossible to try them all. It really is. But for me, the Corrado series and the Metaniums. Now, the Metaniums are hands down, that is the smoothest reel. Like, when it comes to flipping, I've got 3 894s and I've got 3 Metaniums on there as well. And the reason is because they are just so smooth and as far as placing the lure right where I want them. Now, my workhorse is of course, the Corrados. They cast a mile. They got big handles. I like that. I like that size of them. They hold a lot of line. They got a good capacity. Especially when you're dealing with a flipping line. If your reel is really small, it won't hold much line because of just the size of it. But they do hold a lot of line. The capacities there. But to me, the Metanium is just like, I keep those close to my chest there because those are the ones that, like, man, that's the moneymaker right there. Like if I had to give up all my rods and reels, I would keep one Metanium and one
894
FBR. Honest to God, that's it.
Are you talking with the new Metaniums with the core solid body?
Oh yeah.
Sure. And that was based off of the Bantam, and that's why I asked you about the Bantam. When it comes to power fishing, I think it's easily, without a doubt, the core solid reel with that one-piece frame really does lend itself to a stronger reel.
Oh, there's no doubt. And one thing about flipping reels, they don't take a lot of abuse until you start setting the hook on them. And then you try to jerk their guts out. That's what you're doing. Like they get snapped. And so if that reel seat's going to get loose on you, or those handles are going to get loose on you, flipping with one for a while, when you get to set the hook a bunch, it'll let you know right away. And and one thing I want to say about when it comes to reels too, when it comes to and I'll be honest with you, it's one of the reasons I first started using Shimano was because I use left-hand retrieve. And so
Bobo said left-handers rule, right, David?
That's exactly. So I use a left-handed retrieve. When I first bought my first bait caster, there was no left-hand retrieves out there. Like they just didn't exist. And so I found one. It was a Shimano, little Bantam Shimano, and I bought it because the handle was on the correct side for me. With the left, I had no idea it was actually the wrong handle. But I have never looked back. I do not, like when I flip and pitch and cast and what have you. I keep the rod in my right hand and I reel with my left hand. I never switch. Spinning reels the same way. I keep the rod in my right hand and I reel with my left hand. I never switch with that. And that was one thing that I was always so excited about with Shimano, is because they didn't just offer a couple of the low end ones for the left hand versions. They came out with the top of the line, top end ones in a left hand retrieve as well. And that I was always thankful for that, because if you don't have a reel that fits you, you just don't like it, you're not going to use them. So, but I
agree.
always thought Shimano was badass because they had that left hand retrieve.
All right, so we got another question here. This one's about a Zodius from Justin over on our YouTube channel. So he's asking best Zodius lineup, best in the Zodius lineup for a 3/8 to half ounce jigs. Now, David, I know you're a Loomis guy, but there is a length and power and action you look for. So if you tell me what you like for that weight jig, I can tell him which Zodius would fit the bill for him.
Okay, so if this jig is like a flipping jig, then I would be around that 4 power in a GLX. Now, maybe a 3 power if these are more like a finesse jig. But if it's a flipping jig, I'm going to stick with that 4 power. If I'm talking finesse jigs or maybe swim jig, then I'm going to go down to that 3 power. So that's where I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay right in that range when I'm fishing a jig.
And you're talking that 890 series, so the 89-inch series, so 7'5".
7'5", 890 series. I'm not going to go down to a 7'1", trying to target place jigs in the areas. I want that longer action. You might start off using those smaller ones, but as soon as you use that longer rod, you'll see that you'll appreciate the difference.
I agree. So for you, Justin, on the Zodius side, the 7'5" medium heavy would be the one that would correlate most to what David's talking about. That rod is rated 3/8 to 1 ounce. So very versatile rod.
That's a
Yeah, it's a big gap. So it'll cover you even if you get into some hydrilla or milfoil flipping and you want a 3/4 or 1 ounce jig, that rod's going to be able to handle that as well. So for me, if I had to tell you for Zodius, ZDS 7.5 MH would be the rod. So 7'5" medium heavy. That should put you right where you want to be. All right. Where are we going now? So folks, we are, David, I told you this would go quick. We're at 57 minutes already. Believe it or not. So folks, if you got any more questions, hit us with them. I have a couple more here to go through. And we really are missing one of the things for power fishing that I think we should talk about outside of, we mentioned power finesse jigs and stuff like that, but big cranks, David. Power fishing involves big crankbaits. And someone here mentioned the good old 955 CBR. That's a crankbait rod. So, he said we need the 955 CBR back. But if you go to the new IMX Pros, that crankbait series in the IMX Pros is very stout from 7 foot all the way up to 7'11", is it not?
Right. I agree, but I'm kind of with him when it comes to that extra length like that, because when it comes to throwing a big crankbait, the reason your big crankbait will reach its depth is because you can throw it further than it's designed to even be thrown. And the longer you can throw it, the deeper that bait will go, and the longer it will stay in the zone that you want it to. So when it comes to that longer fishing rod, I'm totally with you. And it has to be a strong, like a 6 power, like you're saying, 6, 7, 8, 9, that stronger power, you need it because it's a heavy lure. It's a heavy bait. So yeah, I'm with you on that longer reach for those cranking rods. The IMX Pros are great. I felt like the older series of the CBRs, the handle was a little short for my liking.
Exactly.
And the newer IMX Pros, that handle is definitely an improvement. It's plenty long enough. It fits up, between your elbow and your ribs there when you're cranking. When you grab it with your second hand there to make that long cast and really, generate some speed, that longer handle is there for you, and it's important. So I'm with you on that really longer. To me, the longer rod on a deep crankbait, the better. It really is. It's to me, even a 7.5 foot rod seems way too short on a big deep crankbait. 8.5 for sure.
So Ryan, just so you know what's available in IMX Pro now, they redid the 906, and I agree with you. That old 906 almost had it felt like a pistol grip in your hand on the back end of it.
Too short. It was too short.
So the new one is changed.
Yeah, yeah.
They have moved it, so it's a 7'6" heavy power, or they consider to be the 906. They consider to be medium heavy, but it's a great jack of all trades rod. But there is now a 968 and a 969, so heavy and extra heavy. So you're talking straight 8-foots.
Yep, yep.
That are available, and those are going to be your big 15 to 20 plus foot diving crankbait rods that will handle that power fishing application.
And get the 969. Get the 9 power. You'll love it. Like if you're throwing a big plug, just get the 9.
And so how do you rig up that 969, David? What's your setup? So I know you said you like a slower gear ratio.
Yeah,
so you're going to go to that 6 in that Corrado. Have you ever used the Corrado 300 actually?
Oh, I tell you what, I still have some of my Calcuttas that I used. I had some Calcutta DCs that was my cranking reel, man. I loved it. But I do have a big Calcutta, a 300 Calcutta for those giant crankbaits, like the 10XDs, those really big ones, just because those things weigh. I don't know how many ounces one of those things weigh, but when
over an ounce, yep.
If you don't have a reel to handle the bait, then you just trying to reel it in was a chore. You go up on that reel size like that, it'll reel that bait in for you way easier. A lot less stress on you. But 10-pound test on those giant baits like that, you can go up to 12, 14 on it, just so you don't break your line when you cast them, because that can happen. They're so heavy, they actually break your line. And the baits are so oversized that drag resistance, you're not going to notice it. It's not going to prevent you from getting to depth. Whereas if, say, you're using like a 20-foot plus crankbait and you put bigger line on it, it'll quit going as deep as you want it to. So, but I use 10-pound FC Sniper fluorocarbon, and I use 6.2 to 1. I love the Corrado K for all those reasons I was talking about earlier, because it has that giant line capacity on there. Big spool, big handle, makes it simpler to reel in a bait that has a lot of resistance. And that's my cranking setup right there. So I use that 10 on everything except those really huge oversized baits. And then I just go up in size only because I just don't want to break them off when I'm trying to heave them out there.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I had the opportunity last fall when Corrado K300 was introduced, and really designed for just that. Super big diving crankbaits,
big stuff,
A-rigs, glide baits, anything that has a lot of resistance in the water.
Yeah. Something that's hard. It's hard to reel in. Right.
Like a musky size spinner bait or a double cowgirl if you're, a toothy critter fisherman. Right. Something that's going to put a lot of resistance on your hand and wear you out faster. Man, that reel, you don't even feel them. Like, back in Texas, they do they almost do the crankbait strolling, that deep flex.
Oh yeah, for sure.
On the ledges where they let out a spool of line, and then on the Ozarks they do it too, where they're just keeping that little wart down in that area. These reels have that extra line capacity to help you do that. That's what you're doing.
That's important. Yeah, that line capacity is important for sure.
Yeah, big time. All right, so I think we answered all of them. And he says, okay, I have the Corrado 301 on that rod. So perfect. Folks, I got to say thank you to everybody. Obviously, thank you to you, David, for joining us tonight and giving us a whole bunch of information.
Okay, I hope it was helpful. I mean, I enjoyed it. And you know how it is, like, whenever we get together, like you said, I missed you at ICAST. If we were at ICAST, we'd probably had this pretty much a similar conversation, to be honest.
Pretty much. So, yeah. No, we really, really appreciate your time tonight, and I hope everything goes well, and I'm wishing you the best of luck in the upcoming season, which is going to be on top of us before we blink. I guess you'll be in Florida before long.
No, we don't have a Florida tournament coming up in the Major League next year. We got our schedules out, and we're not going to be starting in Florida. We're going to be starting in Texas. So,
okay, that's a change.
That's unusual, but hey, starting in Texas ain't going to hurt my feelings any.
I guarantee you it won't, especially because you'll probably get to use a jigs somewhere in that tournament.
No doubt. Them chatterbait rods and them jig rods are going to get, we're going to line those up first.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you very much, folks. Thanks for joining us once again. We do this every 2 weeks. These Shimano schools are really designed to help people, whether you're a seasoned pro in a specific, technique or species, or you're looking to check something out new. We go back and forth between saltwater and freshwater every other week. So next week, I've got Carter Andrews joining us. We're going to be talking saltwater fishing. And for those of you who don't know, Carter is a diehard smallmouth angler. So hope everybody's doing well. I hope to see you in a couple of weeks. Have yourselves a great night. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Thank you.